Hi Tom, welcome back to 10 by 6.
Hello, Jace. Lovely to see you. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Absolutely. Welcome back, everybody. Talking about gaslighting this week, and the way in which propaganda, semantics, and power-laden language is used to defecate on our consciousness, shall we say.
Good phrase.
Over to you, Tom.
Indeed. Well, I just wanted to share half a dozen examples. In some cases, I'll provide the actual truth rather than the gaslighting language, but just half a dozen examples of hundreds and hundreds, which of course we could highlight. And this has really come about because of this week's fanfare announcement of the lifting of COVID restrictions, which I'll come back to shortly. But it's the language used around that's particularly gaslighting us all. But I want to give 6 examples. The first one I'm just going to share with you, and I'll buzz through them fairly quickly. The first one is the notion that the last Labour government bankrupted the UK. We hear that term all the time, brought the country to the edge of bankruptcy, etc. And of course, associated with that, there's the gaslighting words used that there's no magic money tree. Of course, we've discovered that there is a magic money tree when the Tories are in charge and they can print their own money and give vast sums of it to their best mates through corrupt, illegal contracts. But the idea that Labour bankrupted the UK or came close to it and massively increased our debt was an enormous lie, and that they did so by overspending on public services, which led to the Tories' austerity agenda and massive cutting of public services, was a huge lie. The actual fact is that the national debt, which is always viewed as a percentage of GDP, and because obviously national debt increases over the decades as money, the value of money changes. So it's always viewed as a percentage of GDP. And for the last Labour government were in charge for 13 years, during which time they invested in public services, they invested in the NHS to bring most waiting lists right down to most of them less than 18 weeks, many much lower than that. They invested in doctors and nurses, they invested in police and fire brigade services. They invested in council services which benefit people and enhance our lives and especially help the most vulnerable, the poorest and most vulnerable. So they invested in those public services, and yet for the first 11 years of Labour government, of 13 years they were in power, they kept the national debt level below the level they inherited from the Conservatives in 1997. Then the global banking crash happened, and the Labour government, in order to stop large banks from going under and people losing their savings and mortgages and houses and things like that, the Labour government, as many other governments did around the world, in America, Germany, etc., bailed out the banks. Now it's arguable whether they should have done that or not, but they used roughly half a trillion pounds, thus doubling the national debt from about half a trillion to around $1 trillion at that time, purely by doing that, by bailing out the banking system, because we have a system based on investment bankers gambling with rich people's money and sometimes losing vast amounts of it. Anyway, but it's certainly Labour, that was the only reason the national debt increased significantly in the last 2 years of Labour government, and there was an associated global recession, massive global recession. But the notion that Labour bankrupted the country by spending lots of money on public services that we can't afford is an absolute lie, a complete gaslight. Associated with that, there was, of course, the note, which David Cameron used to keep in his top pocket and bandy it around, not just in the next election in 2015. And the note was written by outgoing Labour Treasury Secretary Liam Byrne, and something that he always regretted because it was used in a most despicable way by the Tories for the next 12 years. They're still using it now. And what most of the public don't know is that that note was a tradition that outgoing Treasury secretaries would leave a note essentially saying that there's no money left for the next incoming Treasury secretary. And that tradition goes right back to Churchill's Treasury secretary. And there have been numerous Tory outgoing Treasury secretaries who have written very similar notes, but Labour have never made a big thing out of it. The Tories chose to exploit that note and have used it very much to win the next 4 elections. And in fact, this whole lie that Labour bankrupted the economy and left this note saying there's no money left, been used by the Tories arguably to win 4 elections and stay in power for 12 years. Even last week, an under pressure Boris Johnson in the House of Commons mentioned the note. He said, remember Labour leaving the note saying there's no money left? They're still using it now. And at the last election in 2019, when criticised for their horrific and murderous austerity policies, every single Tory MP said things like, well, we had to make the tough economic decisions because Labour left us in such a mess. And in fact, as you know, Tory governments proportionately create more debt than Labour governments in the history of government. And since pre-COVID, the Tories, of course, doubled our national debt from around 1 trillion to 2 trillion, whilst carrying out this massive austerity agenda, cutting public services, freezing wages, destroying people's lives, and so forth. So, can
I just say 2 things on that? As I say, very briefly, 2 things on that. The letter is a joke. It's always been a joke. It's been a joke going back decades. It's not just a tradition. It's a joke that one Treasury Minister leaves to the next Treasury Minister after an election.
Absolutely.
So we need to be really clear on that. And also, we need to remember that the austerity cuts that took place from 2008 when they started to take place, but certainly is part of the agenda for the Tory government from 2010 onwards. The cuts have led to a doubling of the debt. And the question a lot of people want to know now is, where has the money gone? And what we're seeing at the moment with the corruption and the links to the Russian oligarchs and the tax havens is that we think we know actually where the money's gone. And it's not into the British economy. It's not into the public sector. It's into the hands of a very small, swollen, corrupt mob of people who we often refer to now as at least being sociopathic, if not psychopathic, because they literally do not care a jot about any of us.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, you're dead right. Our public services have been destroyed. Austerity has destroyed so many lives, been completely unnecessary. And when we ask where, and they've doubled the debt pre-COVID, and when we ask where the money's got, all we have to do is see the number of wealthy people that are shopping for super yachts these days. You know, they're 100 million, 200 million pounds on a super yacht. It's quite a building super yachts is quite a lucrative business these days. Anyway, and just the last thing along with that, in terms of semantics and propaganda and gaslighting, how many people now believe the mantra Labour can't be trusted with the economy? Whereas if you look at it factually, in recent times and over a long period of time, over a century or more, it's actually the Conservatives that can't be trusted with the economy, not Labour, and the Conservatives that create more debt and not Labour. Anyway, going on to the COVID restrictions, great fanfare, as I said this week, that we're the first country in the world to lift all remaining COVID restrictions, and they're always called restrictions. And that fascinates me just from a semantics point of view. No one likes restrictions. Everyone wants to throw off restrictions and be free. And of course, in America, it's very much about freedom from restrictions. But if those things that are restrictions were called public health measures, or if they were called health prevention measures or health protection measures, if those terms were used, people would, of course, view them very differently and far more favourably. But because they're always called restrictions, that enables the government to make the choices they've made, which of course we've got 180 plus thousand deaths from COVID, because they do so under the guise of lifting restrictions and giving people their freedom. And it was sad really to see this week, you know, the BBC showed on the day that Johnson made his announcement, showed a succession of people in the street celebrating essentially the lifting of remaining restrictions. But actually, and it was called, you know, the lifting of restrictions. If you ask people in the streets, I'd love to actually do this and just go into the street and say, yeah, really good that we lifted all the remaining restrictions, isn't it? And people say, yes, yes. And I say, can you name one? Because actually what Boris Johnson announced this week, the only restriction really that he announced was ending was the one where if you test positive for a deadly virus, you have to stay home and not give it to anyone else. That was the only restriction that he lifted, which is shocking that is now being lifted. If you test positive, you can just carry on your daily business, go to work, go wherever and give it to other people. But other than that, he announced the stopping of free testing. So we'll have to pay for our tests. He announced the stopping of COVID payments for self-isolating. If you test positive and are off work, you don't get the additional COVID payments, which means people that test positive can't afford to stay home. They will be going to the workplace because they can't afford not to. And the stopping of releasing publicly the data on the number of cases and deaths that we have in this country. Those are the things he actually announced this week. Those aren't restrictions whatsoever. No, there's no restrictions. But of course, that's how it was sold to us, the plebs. And meanwhile, as I say, on top of 180,000 people dying, the last weekly figures for deaths, week ending 4th of February, was over 1,390 people died of COVID. For months now, we've had a rate of death, an annual rate of death of between 50 and 90,000 people a year dying of COVID, and we're still there now. So quite staggering how this has been sold to us as the lifting of remaining restrictions and something to celebrate. Next thing I wanted to mention was just some quick other examples, of course, related to COVID and other things. Johnson uses the Trump playbook of describing everything they do as world beating. You know, world beating test and trace, world beating this, world beating that. And of course, the reality is far, their policies and their actions far from world beating. And that's straight out of the Trump playbook, who has, you know, written books or had people write books for him about his philosophy of just bragging. It's just, you know, narcissistic bragging, just pretending everything is the biggest and the best.
But what the population also need to know is that there's multiple leaders of different countries across the planet saying exactly the same thing. And they can't all be right.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're all world beating. Yeah. And just going on to Trump then, you know, I mean, one of the things that, one of the huge things that Trump did, you know, as well as his narcissistic bragging, was within a few months of taking office in you know, in 2017, was to implement by far the biggest tax cut in history, 2 trillion tax cut. And you know, he used to, you know, have these big rallies, huge rallies full of his crowds, and he'd say things and they'd all cheer and applaud without knowing the truth. And I always wanted there to be sort of someone doing some commentary over the top. When Trump said something, they would then say the truth and see what the crowd's reaction would be. So when Trump says, I've enacted the biggest tax cut in American history, and the crowd all cheer, and then for the commentary to say 83% has gone of those tax cuts has gone to the richest 1%, and people would go, yeah, oh, that's rubbish, that's terrible. Same with regulations. You know, he'd brag about getting rid of, scrapping all these regulations, which is of course the right-wing mantra, to have a bonfire of the regulations, scrap the regulations. And he'd talk about it, you know, like regulations, like restrictions are a bad thing, you know, and to live free, we need to be free from these regulations. And of course, you know, and when he'd say, I've got rid of all these regulations, the crowd would cheer. I'd love for the commentary to be, that means you're your food standards, your environmental protections, and your rights in the workplace. And people go, yeah, oh, that's crap. That's really bad. If people knew the reality.
I read a wonderful report at the end of last week, I think it was, and it talks about the celebration from, Brexiteers, leavers, whatever we want to call those people who voted in the referendum to leave the European Union. And one of them, again, was along the lines of what you were talking about in terms of the bonfire of regulation, right? And yet this report was showing that currently the UK is having to find or employ 50,000 plus new bureaucrats in this country to do what the EU was doing in Brussels or Strasbourg or wherever. You can't make it up, the irony.
You can't. And alongside regulations, they talk about red tape and scrapping red tape. And that was part of how Brexit was sold. But of course, now companies themselves are absolutely, massively burdened now with huge amounts of paperwork and red tape, which is costing them lots of money to implement, especially obviously with exports and even imports. But last couple of quick things. I watched CNN the other night, and they were talking about what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, and they had a succession of military and ex-military generals and people like that talking about what's happening, and using the words like inevitable and unavoidable when talking about military action. Saying things like military action is now inevitable, military action is now unavoidable. And without us thinking critically about how those phrases are thrown at us, we very easily absorb those into our consciousness and believe them. We suddenly believe that military action, war, death, destruction is inevitable and unavoidable, when of course it never is, and it never should be. And we should all be saying that. We should be saying it to our MPs. We should be on the streets demanding that there is no more war. But fascinating how those words and phrases are used, and how they seep into our consciousness. And of course, the same people that said there were weapons of mass destruction, the very same people that said there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that led to 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, are the same people now telling us these same lies about things in Ukraine and telling us military action is now inevitable. So,
no, I was only going to say, it's what we've talked about before, which is really, really important. If you go into Parliament and you vote to send the public or some of the public in your country off to fight, then the very people who vote yes, that should happen, should be right at the vanguard. They should be prepared to put a uniform on, prepared to do the training if they haven't had it already, and be at the vanguard. Otherwise, shut your mouths.
Absolutely. Send their sons and daughters. If the people that make decisions to go to war had to send their sons and daughters there first, we'd have a very peaceful world.
Exactly.
Yeah. The last example I had was illegal refugees. And in fact, in America, they get called illegal aliens, quite an abhorrent term. The idea that human beings are illegal, not as an adjective, not as a description of their actions, but a description of them as a person. They're an illegal. I mean, that's just so abhorrent. But of course, the reality is people are gaslighted to believe that people coming here, including people coming on boats from the French borders, come here illegally. And the truth of the matter is that's absolutely not true. There is nothing illegal in international law for people to arrive on the shores of your country, via any method, by plane, by train, by automobile, by boat. However people arrive at your country and then claim asylum or refugee status, no method by which they came makes them illegal. And certainly, and as I say, that includes by boat. It is not illegal for people to turn up here by boat under international law. And of course, what our government under Priti Patel have done is to stop or greatly reduce the opportunity for people from abroad to claim asylum. They have to be set foot in this country before they can lodge a claim for asylum or to be treated as a refugee. So they've closed down the opportunity to apply from abroad, forcing people into boats. And then they say they're illegal, and then they, you know, get their media allies to write horrifically racist and anti-immigrant things on their front pages, saying we're being invaded. You know, it's quite despicable. But yeah, so the language used with that and with all these examples, and we could give several hundred other examples of how language is used to gaslight us and change our consciousness in a way that's very unhelpful, but certainly helps the ruling class.
Yeah. Well, defecation of the consciousness is never going to be a positive, is it? Thank you so much, Tom, for identifying those examples. Massive, huge, symbolic examples of how the public right now, not talking historically, we're talking right now, are being taught to believe lies. And the only way around that is for us all to be able to start to learn how to critically think, how to start confronting information that we have as neutrally as we possibly can, and to do the research and the investigation and to form conclusions that have validity. Otherwise, what are we? We're just puppets, muppets of criminals, of sociopaths, of psychopaths. And does anybody really want that epitaph? Because I know I certainly don't, and I'm pretty damn sure you don't either.
Absolutely. Well said, Jace.
Have a great week, everybody. Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.
Thanks for watching.
Take care.
Thanks for watching. Cheers, Jace. Bye, mate.